Sometimes I'll get asked what grit sandpaper is best for a particular surface, and to be honest, I don't think it's something I've either done a video on or explained properly. The grit of the sandpaper is really important, because if you use something that's too coarse, then you can damage the surface. So it's important to know which is best for which particular surface. If you're unsure, you'd always start with a finer grit, and if you think that's not doing much at all, go to something a more coarse grit. So I'm going to show you the grits that I use between 3 and 4 different grits on a job, for different surfaces, for different reasons. So if a surface isn't too bad, we'll start with a wall. If the walls aren't too bad, I will start sanding with a 120 grit. The reason why I use that is because it isn't too coarse. It's not going to damage the surface, and if there's any thicker bits or any filler that was missed by the previous painter, then I can get that sanded down, no problem. If anything was a bit more heavily painted, then I would use an 80 grit. And a lot of people will say that seems a bit extreme, but it's not. If it's going to get the worst of it sanded down, and then I can swap to a 120 grit. That's all that's for. It's gonna take the heavy away, and then I can move down in the grits. It's the same with doors and woodwork. If it's not too bad, me personally, I start again with a 120 grit. It'll key the surface, sand it down nice, and I can then do a first coat, and then before my second coat, I'll use a 240 grit. If the woodwork is heavily painted, I'll go in with an 80 grit. Anything more than that, I would be looking to strip the paint off. So I'll show you what the sanding pads that I use, show you what they look like, and tell you a little bit more about them. So these are the hand sanding pads that I use. There's many other brands available. These are just my preferred ones. So you can see there's 4 different grits here. So there's an 80, a 120, a 240 and a 320. The higher the number, the finer the grit. So 320 is really fine compared to an 80, which is going to be quite rough. So these are the 4 pads lined up next to each other. So this is an 80. You can see that's a lot more rough. That's a 120, 240 and a 320. So you can see how fine this one is compared to the 80. Now I prefer to use hand sanding pads rather than traditional sandpaper. Reason being, it's a lot nicer on your hands. It's nicer to hold. The backing, sponge backing. The hand sanding pads are a lot easier to hold as well. So as an example, if you're sanding, say this windowsill, you can just wrap it around nicely and do whatever you need to do. You haven't got to bend sandpaper to shape. This will take the shape of whatever you are wanting to sand. If you are familiar with wet and dry sandpaper, then you can use these the same way. You can put them in some water if you need to get something sanded down a bit finer without causing any kind of damage. They're ideal for that. So as an example, if a door was heavily painted, there was a lot of runs, you would go in with the 80 grit. That's what's going to get rid of all the heavy, thick edges, any of the runs. You would then swap to a 120, and then the 120 will sand the rest of the door, make it nice and smooth. The reason why it's important to switch is because if you stuck with that 80 grit, you're then going to start damaging the surface. You're going to start chewing the wood up pretty much. It's going to cause more damage than anything. So the next grit down isn't going to cause any damage. It's just going to do what you need it to do. So once you've used the 120, I would do a coat of undercoat. Once that's dry, I'll check it. Then I would use a 240. And it's, again, because I've done a fresh coat of paint and I've done some prep, I don't want to cause any more damage. I don't want to disrupt my coat of paint. I just need to key it for the next coat. and make sure there's nothing sitting on the surface. And then I would do my finishing coat, and then that should be job done. If I am to do another coat on, say, like a windowsill where there's a lot of light cast, and I want to make sure it is as best as it can be, I will then give it another light rub over with a 320, and that's going to cause no damage at all. It's just going to take whatever's sitting on that surface away, specks of dust, anything, and just key my last coat, and then clean it down, and then do that final coat. So I hope that all makes sense. The lower the number, the rougher the grit. The higher the number, the finer the grit. But any comments, I'll do my best to advise you what's best for whatever you're working on.